afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 12th event of the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, Decolonizing Europe online series. My name is Beste İşleyen, and together with my colleague Tasnim Anwar, we are the convener of this series. And the topic of today's event is Decolonizing the Non-Colonizers, Historicizing Eastern Europe in Global Colonialism. And this is the 12th session of our series. And in this session, we shift our gaze to Eastern Europe and discuss the place of Eastern Europe in the history of global colonialism. And I am really happy to be hosting today two speakers who are experts in this field. So I would like to welcome them. Our first speaker is Zoltan Ginnelli, who is a critical geographer and independent researcher from Budapest, Hungary. And he's currently working on his book on the global history of the quantitative revolution. And among others, Zoltan is member of Karl Polanyi Research Center and is curating for the 2021 of Biennial Budapest. And Zoltan is also the founding admin of Decolonizing Eastern Europe Facebook and Twitter social media accounts. And I highly recommend all of you to follow these accounts to get updates about recent publications, but also other discussions. So our second speaker is James Mark, who is a professor of history at the University of Exeter. So James has been part of projects aimed at rethinking Eastern European history in the context of global empires and their ends. And he is recipient of prestigious grants to explore these topics. And he has also authored and co-authored several books which came out such prestigious university publishing houses as Oxford and Yale. And James has an upcoming book at Oxford, which reframes Eastern Europe, European history as part of a global history of empires and their ends. So I also would like to inform you that this event is co-organized by ACES and Zoltan Ginnelli to foster dialogue on decolonizing Eastern Europe. And with this, I would like to invite Zoltan to tell us about this mini-series that we are organizing together. Zoltan.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, Besta, for the wonderful opportunity. As part of the Decolonizing Europe series at ACES, I've been offered the opportunity to invite some colleagues to introduce the theme of decolonizing Eastern Europe. What's the importance of this topic? Now, in current academic discourse on postcolonialism and decolonialism, the field is still dominantly Anglo-centric and also Anglophonic. And Eastern Europe is largely missing from colonial histories. However, this is a strongly changing field in the past, like 1 or 2 decades. New literature on Eastern Europe's relation to coloniality and race within global and transnational histories has emerged. And these empirical materials often challenge our mainstream conceptions of coloniality and global colonial history. So together with colleagues in the field, we found it very much timely to assess this literature and also to represent Eastern European scholars in the field. On the other hand, this approach has been strongly neglected or marginalized in Eastern Europe too. It's mostly not funded, yet the topic is highly politicized. So it's a good question, why do Eastern European academics not frame their analysis as part of colonialism? So our initiative tries to understand why this double negligence is systemic. But we'd also like to reflect on the differences in Eastern Europe, why the empirical coverage of the topic is also rather uneven. If you compare what came out from Poland or Yugoslavia, or maybe even the Czech Republic, compare that to Hungary or Romania, which is largely unresearched in many cases. On the other hand, why a specific focus on this region is important in understanding global colonial history and approaches to postcolonialism and decolonialism. So for example, how does this post-socialist condition affect this discourse? Within acts of decolonizing, the British, French, US, and increasingly German institutions have monopolized agency. Now there's also the three worlds argument of the second world being part of post-socialist modernity and the third world being part of post-coloniality. But There's also the fact that Eastern European knowledge has been often exoticized or segregated and ultimately not included within the global narratives of our shared histories. Or empirical material was used only to supplement West developed concepts. So the aim of the series, this mini series, is to demonstrate why a focus on Eastern Europe makes a difference and carries the potential in contributing to transforming our existing conceptions of global colonial history and what role this region played in global colonialism and decolonization movements, which is largely missing from the field. We will argue that this will, throughout the series, that this is partly because Eastern Europe occupied an antagonistic in-between position globally, being not quite white and mediating, occupying a mediating role that is often called semi-peripheral. So we should accept these contradictions and not take them as refuting the legitimacy of speaking about a colonial Eastern Europe, and talk about the entanglements, probably the trans-imperiality and trans-coloniality that fuses and integrates Eastern Europe globally. And finally, we should also talk about, and throughout the series, we try to focus on the role of Eastern European scholars and the political stakes of this type of criticism in the region. So we need to acknowledge the need to combat precarity and marginalization of Eastern European scholars within the field, and look at what role this type of criticism and knowledge production plays politically in Eastern Europe, and how to develop strategies against dependency, how to criticize the catching up to the West narratives by, in this case, and especially on this occasion, by developing and historically rediscovering this kind of interperipheral alliances between Eastern Europe and the global South against the core. So how can we look at Eastern Europe not from the Western lens, but for example, from the global South, what the global South thought, thinks, and how it approaches Eastern Europe is also an important question. So finally, in this particular event, James and I will try to overview and summarize some of our joint work since late 2015, I think, which was part of two research projects. One was 1989 after 1989, which was about the global history of Eastern Europe connected to the system change. And the second was Socialism Goes Global, both led by the University of Exeter, and both projects have led us not only to think about the global history of Eastern Europe by looking at the relations between Eastern Europe and the global South, but also to look broadly at the global history of Eastern Europe from the perspective of colonialism, anti-colonialism, and decolonization. So this is the topic that we'll jump into.
Yeah, thanks, Zoltan, for this extensive introduction, and it also connects very well with my first question. But before that, I would like to remind our audience that you can send us your questions using the Q&A box. And also follow ACE's social media accounts and check the website for the upcoming events. We already have a confirmed event for April 7th as the second event in the context of the Decolonizing Eastern Europe series. So the announcement and registration will be out soon. So my first question connects very well with what you have extensively outlined, Zoltan. So both of you in your work point out that Eastern Europe has largely been missing from debates on colonialism, postcolonialism, and decoloniality. But as Zoltan has said, this absence is to do with the common differentiation made between Western Europe as former colonies versus Eastern Europe as non-colonizers. You, however, argue that decolonial approaches are still applicable to Eastern Europe. So can you please unpack for us this a little bit? How can we decolonize Eastern European history in that respect?
Okay, this is a huge topic. We only have a few minutes to address this, so I'll try to focus on the contemporary context, or at least start from the contemporary context and look at how this opens up a global history. So, as we saw last year, after the Floyd incident, the upheaval, the Black Lives Matter protests in the United States, but also in other parts of Western Europe, the anti-racist and decolonization movements, and the issue of decolonizing academia has come to the fore. And perhaps this was the first time, from my view, when there was a very strong perception and of these matters within Eastern Europe. And it became highly politicized. Now, it focused mainly on statue and memory politics and did not really deal with the larger, wider histories of decolonization movements or anti-racist movements. And but what we could see in current political discourse in Hungary, just to take it as an example in Eastern Europe, it became common to say that we will not become colonies. So we protest the West, and even the Black Lives Matter movement became a sort of Western threat, a threat of Western politics intruding into this region. But the second thing was that we never had colonies. So therefore, we are actually not responsible for colonialism. That's the responsibility and the guilt of the West, right? So what political discourse constructed was this dividing line between the colonizer and the non-colonizer Europe. And this was why we gave this title, Decolonizing the Non-Colonizers. And what we try to point out in this session is that recent academic and political analysis on, for example, the Orban regime or the rise of authoritarianism in the region or right-wing populism seldom historicize these discourses. So we can discuss whether political theory could be, refined through geography and history. And there's an unrecognized depth, and there are recurring arguments that current right-wing populists only successfully exploit today. But this argumentation actually reaches back to the socialist era, even the interwar period, and even beyond in the 19th century, or maybe even beyond that. So Eastern Europeans had in many ways actively positioned themselves, even back then, within global colonialism. And I argue in my work that the ways the region related to colonialism had been conditioned by its semi-peripheral structural integration into the capitalist world system. Now we will talk about this in the next session, probably, as far as I know, in more detail. So this world systemic analysis. My personal initial motivation was to put Hungarian colonial discourse, as it's in our current political discourse, the various ways it was addressed in a global historical context. So what is the challenge and potential of understanding East Europe in colonial history? How does looking from colonial discourse reassemble our previous experiences or national cultures and canons and histories? And how does this offer a disruptive comparative perspectives on dependency, indebtedness, inequality, the issue of comprador elites, contested sovereignties, and even race, as Eastern Europeans were often racialized. So how does this offer a shared experience with the global South? And I'll just give a few examples just to jump through, and maybe we could return to these in the Q&A. So for students, I often say that we could compare the 140 years of Ottoman rule in Hungary, or perhaps the 300, 400, and even beyond rule of Ottoman in the Balkans with the brief 70 years colonization in Africa, and think about the various differences in colonization and what colonization would mean, what these specific colonizations, how they differ regionally, and what difference they make. They mean different things for different regions. Now, Eastern Europe is not present in historical accounts of global colonial history, mostly because they themselves were often assimilated into larger empires. Very often names were unidentified. For example, Hungarians we have some traces of Hungarians fighting in Pizarro's army, who dwelled in Cusco in the Andes. Hungarian sailors served in the Dutch East India Company. Hungarian colonists arrived in the Americas. They had a huge role in cartography and science connected to colonialism. There were Hungarian Jesuits in 17th and 18th century South America who were very active, also active in building early capitalist plantation production. We had Hungarian missionaries, Hungarian missionary literature connected to China. And the colonial world featured in fantasies of living in or acquiring colonies, even in Eastern Europe. in the 19th century, but also later on in the 20th. Now, very often major political economic crises led to emigration to the colonies and ideas of escapism and to start over or to organize political resistance from the colonies. We can give the example of the failed 1848 independence war against the Habsburgs, for example, in Hungary. Many of these people fought under the Ottomans against the Habsburgs, so continued this fight or tried to organize themselves in the USA and establish colonies or elsewhere in the colonial world. So when we look at, for example, escapism and this kind of starting over after crisis and being beaten up by other empires and then how to fight back, we see these entanglements with coloniality and the colonial world. And we see that this is a specific peripheral or semi-peripheral connection to global colonial history. Now this, and finally, I think we should use to actually challenge the West-led narratives and networks of knowledge accumulation around colonial history and around race, as it is discussed in Western metropoles. If there's this criticism of Southern theory versus Northern theory, we should also think about putting in the global East and how this differentiates this kind of North as we think about it critically, and perhaps just looking elsewhere into histories that are not from the perspective of the West, but from the perspective of these interactions between the East and the South. And finally, decolonizing is a very problematic term in itself, which has been appropriated by Western academia in many cases. And it's a question whether this grand narrative of colonial history, which is occupied by the development of West-led capitalism and the transatlantic context, the industrial and scientific revolution, how can this be, rethought through Eastern European history? And why is the Eastern European integration into this broader history missing from the story? Right, so, and lastly, I think I'd offer a few concepts which you might think, connecting to the examples which I shared, think about not just transnational and global histories, but trans-imperiality and trans-coloniality as interweaving these Eastern European positions and contexts throughout global history.
Yeah, thank you, Zoltan, for the very extensive and generous reply. I am definitely interested in the debates about the Ottoman Empire because I am Turkish and my grandparents are from previous Ottoman territories in the Balkans. So I would be happy to get some reading suggestions from you to also improve my knowledge about where the Ottoman Empire stands in the colonialism debate. So James, may I ask the same question to you? How can we decolonize Eastern European history?
Thank you very much, Beste. Thank you very much to ACES as well for organizing this event and giving us the possibility to talk. It's nice, well, not to see you all. I can't see my audience, but I know there are 138 people here, so thank you for coming today. I suppose the first thing I want to say is there have been multiple attempts over the 20th century to think about Eastern Europe and its relationship to global colonialism. This is not the first wave, right? And it's been thought about in terms of not just decolonial, but kind of in anti-colonial terms, in post-colonial terms, and maybe it's worth thinking through a few of those. And of course, I mean, the Russian Revolution itself and the kind of promise of its leadership for a new kind of anti-colonial world is central, of course, to this story. By the late 1930s, you have a whole set of economists in Eastern Europe and others thinking about the relationship of Eastern Europe, now as free states and their relationship to kind of peripheries and anti-colonial movements around the world. You have this, of course, in relation to the reactions to the Holocaust, and you have people like Aimé Césaire and W.B. Du Bois thinking about forms of global oppression and discrimination in global terms that connects the Jewish experience in Eastern Europe to a broader racial struggles. You have, of course, the rise of world systems theory in the 1970s, which thinks about Eastern Europe as a semi-peripheral space that can turn to anti-colonialism and to alliances with other semi-peripheries from Latin America to East Asia, let's say, but is also capable of mainly allying with the West and seeing it as a kind of swing region. after the collapse of communism, you also had the emergence of what I would call maybe a right-wing post-colonialism, or what was self-described as post-colonialism. And this particularly came out of the Baltics and from Poland, and attempted to draw on insights from post-colonial theory to think about throwing off imperial Soviet mentalities, if you want. But this was mainly, actually, I think, a right-wing anti-communist form of post-colonialism, and for that reason, many post-colonial thinkers question whether it should be called post-colonial at all, seeing as it was set on actually rediscovering kind of Eurocentric forms of knowledge and ignored questions of race. But it was self-described as post-colonial. So I think what this sort of decolonial project is doing is obviously quite different from that. And I think, as Zoltan said, is embedded in a much broader attempt to think about decolonizing European history, of which obviously this series is a kind of wonderful showcase. And thinking that both the history of European institutions like the European Union or of European nation states has to be thought about as constituted through parts of global colonial and racial formations. But I mean, as Zoltan was intimating, this argument has for the most part been pursued for Western European imperial countries, where the utility of dissolving the barriers between the national and the imperial seems much more self-evident. And up until quite recently, I think historians of Eastern Europe have exempted themselves from those kinds of questions, as Zoltan said, because we never held empires. So histories tend to present the development of nation states rather as a series of liberation struggles from regional empires or federations. It's not a kind of global question. But what might change if we thought about the development of Eastern European nations by actors thinking and acting within racialized world hierarchies, which were structured around kind of universal standards of Western European imperial civilization. So maybe just to start the conversation, I want to suggest maybe 3 ways in which this is starting to be done by scholars. And as Zoltan was saying, this is now getting underway, I think. So I think people are looking at the formation, particularly of 19th century Eastern European nationalisms, national movements, particularly in the case of Poland and Hungary, where the realization of statehood, autonomy, sovereignty, and so on was very much tied up with a broader participation in European colonial culture, and often with imperial fantasy, even ones that aren't necessarily realized. There's a very nice recent book by Lenny Aurelio Valerio on exactly this question in Poland. Then I think there's also a set of literature emerging on the ways in which ideas forged in empire about colonies, peripheries, and so on, came to structure how Western Europeans came to think about and indeed treat Europe's eastern periphery. So how the colonial treatment of the Balkans in the late 19th century is kind of related to broader colonial ideas, particularly how Poles are treated under German Empire now, and also I think most established and probably most well known is the ways in which forms of colonial ordering and violence developed in Africa come back to Eastern Europe through Nazi Empire and the Holocaust. I mean, that literature is probably best known. But also I think there's another interesting body of literature emerging on the ways in which ideas of development, and particularly development of nation building, development, hinterlands, peripheries, are informed by broader ideas of colonial development. So there's been recently some work by Victoria Schmidt, for example, on interwar Czechoslovakia, or by Catherine Tsienza on the Kresy, Poland's eastern borderland, and the ways in which ideas of colonial development are brought into these into Eastern Europe's own easts, if you want, and draw on colonial ideas as they attempt to develop so-called backward minorities. So these are maybe some ways in which these questions are starting to animate Eastern European studies.
Oh, thank you, James. My second question touches upon some of the things that you have briefly introduced, the question of whiteness and the limited engagement in Eastern European studies with the question of whiteness. So you, in your writings, point out that Eastern Europe has a semi-peripheral relation to racism and white supremacy, while there is also the commonly accepted view that Eastern Europeans themselves have been racialized, and they have been subject to racialized categories of identification and othering. So how can we then understand this seemingly contradictory position, which Zoltan names as frustrated whiteness? And how can academic practice recover the absence of racism and whiteness in Eastern European scholarship? James, would you like to respond to this?
Yes, so as you were intimating at the end of your question, I mean, I think there's long been a reluctance to see Eastern Europe as part of broader global racial orders. You know, that one might use issues of ethnicity and religion to explore nation building, relationship to minorities and so on. But this broader racial question and relationship to global racial orders hasn't really been central. But again, I mean, as in other areas, that is increasingly being challenged. And scholars such as Medina Tlostanova, Catherine Baker, Oniko Imre, Dusan Bielic. I mean, these people are all bringing these questions of whiteness to the fore. I think there's also a political context in which it's happened, and this particular populist moment in which both populists from within the region are using a much more public, explicit language of whiteness and its defense, a defense of a white Christian Europe. And at the same time, a kind of populist international beyond, particularly from the Americas, is framing Eastern Europe as a kind of last white fortress, if you want. And with this much more prominent language of whiteness, I think it's also prompted people to think much more about its history. So it's often said, I think, that there isn't really an explicit language of whiteness. It has to be read in, it's somehow not there. And actually that's not what I've seen at all, both from my own work and I think from the work that others are doing. And there's quite a bit of work now that tries to counter the idea that these kind of racial ideas are not operative internally within Eastern Europe. So you find particularly work that's done from the perspective of minorities, particularly Jews and the Roma. And I mean, just to point out one recent work by Sunny Rucker Chang, which brings the experience of the Roma into dialogue with the African-American experience of both liberation from slavery and also the civil rights struggle. And so attempts to bring how minorities perceive issues of whiteness, how they construct ideas of whiteness into kind of comparative global frameworks, is doing a lot of really good work. I'm thinking also of work on interwar Eastern Europe, which explores the Jewish experience, particularly in the context of plans for forced migration out of the region in the interwar, and the ways in which Jews are talked about as not quite white. Do they belong to white Europe? Do they not? Can they survive in the tropics if they go to Madagascar? If they're white Europeans, maybe they cannot, but are they? So these kinds of questions are often discussed with regard to minorities. I guess the other area in which you can pick up very explicit references to whiteness is in how Eastern Europeans have had to negotiate their position in a broader racialized world, in which their claims often on the full privileges that whiteness could bestow are contested. So going back to your kind of question of frustrated whiteness or in-betweenness. So, feeling that one is belonging to a region in between, often denigrated, seen as a colonizable space from the West, treated as lesser Europeans or not quite white, but at the same time wanting the benefits of that whiteness, participating in European colonial cultures, or indeed in some cases colonial ventures, fantasizing about colonies, and as I said, bringing often the techniques of colonial management into the development of peripheries and in policies towards minorities. And we can look certainly at kind of pivotal moments when this discussion of whiteness really comes to the fore. And I mean, you could pick many, but one interesting one may be to look at the formation of new Eastern European states after World War I, which coincides, of course, with a moment of, very racialized fear of a decline of a white West against kind of rising tide of Black nationalism and also the fears of the so-called yellow peril, the rising East, right? And of course, many people spot that the granting of independence to new states, from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and so on, is granting states to white Europeans. whilst others are left behind. So it's very clear if you look, if you look at African American or African nationalist voices in the 1920s, this is pointed out all the time, but it's also internal to the region, or at least internal to Europe as well. Because on one hand, those people arguing against the establishment of new states, say Poland, often use very racialized language derived, often very derogatory racialized language derived from empire to describe Poles or Czechs as less than white. So this, and so not deserving, not ready for statehood in the same way that Africa might not be. On the other hand, you have this appeal to whiteness on the part of some nationalists. So this idea that there has to be a defense of the white West and the establishment of our countries will contribute to that. It should be said, on the other hand, that many people try to undermine this framing, right? So I was recently looking at material from Hungarian social democrats who are saying, this idea of a racialized white West is, is silly. The future of the world is Eurasia. Let's not go there. So this is part of a debate, but it is explicit. It's there, and it's not a hidden language to anywhere near the degree that some people will argue that it is. Thank you.
Thank you, James. So Zoltan, can I ask you this question about what you call frustrated whiteness?
Yes, sure. Of course, it's not just about frustrated whiteness, but I think this wider issue of how and what, so how does Eastern Europe make a difference when we talk about whiteness connected to postcolonialism and decolonialism, or does it? Because very often, I think the main issue is, just to be a bit provocative, is that can Eastern Europe be simply treated as a neglected case study of white supremacy? Or is it something much more? Because truly whiteness and Eurocentrism have not been addressed much in the region. There are reasons for that. Even in the anti-colonial socialist period, this issue of Eurocentrism, for example, was largely neglected. In many cases, we could talk about differences, of course, or even if there was some criticism, it has been forgotten. But there's also this kind of a global projection from the global South on Europe as white. We can also talk about Occidentalism or things like that, which conceal Eastern European difference, so that Eastern Europe does make a difference. But very often these kind of, for example, Eastern perspectives show how Eastern Europe made a difference. If we think of the relations between Japan and Hungary, for example, or Central Asian countries, where previous geopolitical ideas and racial fantasies of forming some sort of Eurasian unity had an effect, even up until today, of how they perceive us. But especially after 1989, with the crumbling of socialist internationalist solidarities, there's a perceived return of European empire, which is similar to what we had during the European concert, when Africa was divided with the active collaboration of Eastern or Central Europeans. For example, the Habsburg Austro-Hungarian monarchy. Or we could talk about pan-European plans of Euro-Africa, where we can talk about the same thing. But there's also that the West often projects racism on Eastern Europe to escape their own racist guilt, while on the other hand, Eastern Europe conceals their colonial compradorship to blame the West, right? So from this perspective, it's interesting to look at White Lives Matter. You can see some of these banners in Romania, for example, but in other places too, throughout Eastern Europe. It's not just an apologetic racist or maybe fascist identity politics, but it also points to the peripheral or so-called frustrated whiteness of how this structural peripherality is neglected by the West, and how Eastern Europe positions attempt to gain recognition from the West by embracing Eurocentrism or whiteness, or their return to Europe. So I think that this semi-peripheral structural setting that I talked about helps us understand the more complicated history of positioning within the region to identify with other racial positions too, not just whiteness, which often expressed an anti-Western critique or solidarity or alliance with others. And I'd just like to give a few historical examples. So we do this exhibition called the Trans-Periphery Movement, Global Eastern Europe and Global South. And one of our materials focuses on negritude in Hungary, how it was accepted, how it was received. And there's René Marin's so-called Negro novel called Batuala from 1921, which focuses on a chieftain's life in West Africa and won the Goncourt Prize in Paris. Now, there was a Hungarian reception of Dezső Kosztolányi, a very famed writer and poet, who translated it as part of a Western liberal cosmopolitanism of like Paris culture, right? But then it was criticized by others like Oskar Damó, who was a folk writer and also film director, who really focused on rural peripherality and poverty in Hungary. And we're in 1922 now, and he argues that this cosmopolitan race discourse from Paris totally dismisses the Trianon crisis, where Hungary was totally disintegrated and Hungary rural peripheries, which he sets against this kind of negritude pan-Africanist bourgeois Africans. But on the other hand, many Jewish writers, for example, Illés Kacér, who also experienced, also were in this position of a post-Trianon minority identity, living in Czechoslovakia as a Hungarian Jew, tried to put himself into this position of being a Negro and wrote a novel called I Congo, Will Not Die, which is actually the first Hungarian Negro novel from 1936, which embraced this kind of Negro position to express this kind of peripheral minority identity in Hungary. But we can also give the example of Turanism, which was promoted in the interwar period kind of heavily, but also today by the government, connected to the Eastern opening and to relations with Central Asia and China, which has a lot of nativist nationalist claims too, as arguing that Hungarians had these Asian origins, which we need to embrace. Now, Turanism has increasingly been, even today, used as a form of anti-Western resistance and an ideology to build alliances with Asia against the West, who sort of who actively disintegrated the Hungarian kingdom through the Trianon Treaty. But this is also connected to other kind of nomadic identities, which then connected Hungarians to Native American Indians, for example, on the same even racial claims of identifying with the Indian because we're also that type of nomadic people. So this kind of identifying with different racial positions was important in the region, and we could perhaps expand on various other examples of how this was employed and used together with whiteness, which I think is a good expression of this kind of semi-peripheral in-betweenness.
Thank you, Zoltan. So there are very good questions coming. I still have 2 questions, but I do not think I will have time to answer to invite you to answer these questions. So I would like to then start with the Q&A, if it's okay for you. So maybe the very brief questions to James. Could you please say again the name of the author who connects Roma experience to that of African Americans?
Sunny Ruka Chang and Felix Chang.
Yeah, if it's possible, can you maybe write it in the chat box too, because we are also downloading the conversation and use it maybe as a resource.
Okay.
Okay, so there is, and thank you for the book suggestion of on the Ottoman Empire and colonialism. That's very useful. So we have a comment by Lisa Gaufman. At the same time, we talk about Eastern European colonization. It's not just going south, it also went east, for example, Russia. So she has a comment on this for us to think about. So I have a question here from Andrew Chandler. In the 1970s in Wales, many historians were interested in the sociological concept of internal colonialism to explain relations between the core and periphery of the British Isles, especially in relation to Celtic language decline in the 19th century and early 20th century. Can this model be used to explain the relationship between Austria, Hungary, and the Slavic nations in the empire, especially between 1867 and 1980? And maybe I can combine it with another question that was about, yeah, it's not directly maybe easy to combine. Yeah, maybe we just start with this question and move to the others. Would like to answer?
I can catch up with the, you know, why just talk about Global South and not East and those matters, if you want. Of course, I mean, the problem was that this is a huge topic. We had very little time. And one of our main arguments, I think, is through historicizing and globalizing this critique, we actually have to offer some new empirical material, which often goes against, you know, accepted conceptualizations. And of course, I mean, looking at, there has been literature on, for example, Russian colonialism and how they reached to even California, and looking at these specific like post-colonial identities that are still intact there. For example, the Russian Orthodox Church is kind of active in, if you look at pilgrimage and things like that. We could also talk about what I hinted on about Turanism and this type of heritage of how to deal with this history. And I have a colleague who works on a project which is about the memory of Hungarian expeditions in Asia and specifically Central Asia, and how people there relate to this history and the specific people that they met or made friendships and various, you know, contexts. So I mean, these looking at Eastern Europe from other perspectives, and not just the Global South, but also we could talk about the East, or how and in which various ways we are part of a so-called Global East, and this kind of Global East argument, which has been written up by others quite nicely, could be used also in how to deal with global colonial history. I have a lot of other inputs, but I think we could go on to the other questions.
James, would you like to say anything about the questions?
Well, I guess there's a kind of question about seeing this question from the point of view of Austro-Hungary, and particularly Vienna, and then also from the Soviet perspective. So I guess one interesting thing maybe to say is to look at the ways in which, you know, nationalist movements in Eastern Europe saw themselves as captive. And, you know, in the case of kind of late 19th century Hungarian nationalism captured by Vienna, right? And particularly actually after, but that was also then also tied to a desire for colonialism beyond the continent. So it's this combined in-between position again. So I mean, Zoltan has done really nice work on this, but after the 1848 revolution, some Hungarian nationalists talking about, okay, well, we failed in Europe, but maybe what we want is a colony elsewhere, where somehow the nation can be protected until the time is right when we can come back and fight our own anti-colonial fight in Europe. So these kind of examples, I think, capture this relationship between the local and the global very nicely. Also, of course, Vienna has to come to terms with the fact that it's not able to get an empire, right? And it sees itself in some ways as a failure compared to the neighboring German empire, right? So it also develops a whole narrative around being too humane, too civilized to be imperialist, right? They're not prepared to use violence in the same way as other Europeans. Of course, this is just a self-serving narrative, right? But it does feed into a broader narrative in the region of, if we were given the chance, then we would have been the better, more humane, more civilized imperialists, right? That we could actually have saved the European imperial project, which increasingly is, you know, degraded by British and French practice in Southern Africa, for example. And actually that notion of being the better humane colonizer feeds into a kind of interwar narrative of trying to get colonies. You find this particularly strongly in Poland, right? And would be the better colonizer. And actually, I think it feeds into communist era anti-colonialism. Although this is although it's, you know, under the banner of anti-colonialism, and, you know, it's committed to anti-colonial struggle, it's also fed by the idea that we are the more humane internationalists, which I think connects back to this earlier regional sentiment. It's not disconnected from it. And then, of course, you know, the Soviet story is incredibly important because, you know, the questions of the relationships between Soviet imperialism in Eastern Europe And the Soviet and Eastern Bloc's commitment to a kind of broader anti-colonialism is of course a huge problem right from the very beginning, when the Red Army comes into Eastern Europe after the Second World War, and gets, of course, revived after 1956 in Hungary as a kind of huge issue. Who is the real colonizer? And so you see, I mean, lots of anti-colonial thinkers, from W.B. Du Bois, who still sees Soviets mainly as anti-colonial, to Fanon, who's not so sure and has to work it through, to, I mean, all these thinkers have to think, are the Soviets anti-colonial or colonial? And this debate you can, of course, trace through the whole Cold War. It also, just one last point, is also a reason why anti-colonial culture actually is quite deeply embedded within Eastern European states. It's not a kind of, sort of fake internationalism just through propaganda, because it can help to express a whole range of political positions under socialism, including those who, adopt an anti-colonial language but turn it against Moscow. Anyway, thanks.
Well, thanks for the generous answers. And of course, this is a vast geography. And when I look at the questions, they cover so many issues and so many areas. And of course, it's not possible that we know all the details, but I really appreciate that you have been very engaging in your answers. So I would like to continue with another question specifically for Zoltan. So our guest is curious to know if you can say a bit more about why you marked the Floyd murder in 2020 as a key event that triggered a larger conversation about decoloniality in Central and Eastern Europe and Eastern Europe. How does that moment compare with other watershed moments for the conversation on decoloniality, such as the so-called migration crisis in Central and Eastern Europe earlier in 2015 and 16, and even the start of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2013? So we have also another question about how we can position the situation of Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania as Eastern European experience in the discourse of this seminar.
Okay.
So,
then perhaps I should start with the direct question. I haven't done like an extensive analysis on how these discourses could be compared or how this evolved. But what was really striking, and I did look into this, is how exactly this moment of the Floyd incident impacted Hungarian political discourse. And it was really an explosion compared to anything other that was before. Even if you look at the 2015 so-called migration crisis, which was also, of course, a refugee crisis and a lot of other crises. Of course, that was totally racialized, and it was an issue where this kind of global positioning of the region was developed against Islam, against the global South. It was racialized. We were defending Europe and Fortress Europe and stuff like that. But the Floyd incident was different in that in political discourse, a lot more was revealed and a lot of other positions emerged against decolonization movements explicitly, and also against the Black Lives Matter movement, which was framed as something that's a Western threat, which was framed as something that's a liberal threat, but also as something that is, anarchist and leftist. And this was the alt-right type of framing. But it was explicitly made like this at that moment and not before. So even before, you had some discussion on that, but it sort of exploded last summer. And just one more short comment is the problem is that we didn't have time to address is there that we can see that the alt-right and the right wing also captures this kind of decolonialist arguments very often. And in this active culture war in Hungary, you can see that books are being published based on, for example, Gramsci's hegemony concept, and even citing African post-colonial workers to support an alt-right argument against the West. But on the other hand, you don't see much from the left, which is also in many ways kind of Eurocentric and not really adept to, address this kind of decolonial criticism. So there are issues with not really engaging with this decolonial critique, which has been sort of captured by the right, and there are no alternatives and no global and integrative critique against this kind of political movement. And the Floyd incident really showed this problem.
Thank you, Zoltan. James, can I invite you?
It's okay, I'll pass.
Okay. So there are other questions coming, and there is one question about how we can explain the rise of racism towards both Hungarian Jews and Roma in 1921-45, and do you see any parallels with white Hungarian attitudes since 1989? And there is a question, but again, I say this is a vast geography, and it's not possible for us to cover every detail history. So please feel free to pass the questions. Another question is on the Polish case. Would you say that a dominant current of thought in the 19th century up until independence in 1918, romantic messianism, the idea of perpetual suffering at the hand of three partitioning empires, served as a justification of Polish attempts at colonizing African territories, or even embarking on a civilizing mission of ethnic communities within the Polish borders? So feel free to choose which one of you would like to address. And again, these are great questions, but yeah.
Yeah.
Shall I kick off?
Yep.
Okay. Well, it's clear that the Polish communist state, right after the Second World War, mobilizes the notion of Poland as a colonized space. For over a century, split between three empires, precisely to express solidarity with those people struggling for independence in Africa and Asia. That's very, very explicit, and it's instrumentalized, right? It's used. I remember work on, the trade ministries use it to try and get business. That we understand your plight. But also, this is often an anti-colonialism that doesn't really think about racial pasts either. So I was particularly struck when I'm looking at the visits of post-colonial leaders to Poland in the 1950s, and it's clear that some things they do get on with. So the defense of borders is really important. How you create sovereign borders, and particularly because Poland is also doesn't have its western border recognized, and and West Germany still contests it, and it's looking for support in African, Asian countries for that. But one thing they don't get on with is questions of race, and so often post-colonial leaders visit, and they say, you've had the most appalling tragedies here, the number of Poles who have died, and also the Holocaust, and can we talk about it? And actually, they're met with a wall of silence around race and talking about the Holocaust in Poland. So whereas people like W.B. Du Bois are starting to talk about, connecting up, different racial tragedies, actually there's this kind of strange barrier between the way in which Eastern European communists think about the world, which is as kind of anti-colonial national struggles, and this kind of racial question is left to one side. But yeah, absolutely, the question of the tripartite division is really always there.
Yes, can I speak? Okay, there are very different, specific historical contexts and geographical contexts popping up. So I don't think we have the time to. I'd really like to continue this later on, where we can address these questions. Just to wrap up some of these questions, somebody asked about Baltics, and of course the position of Russia, and implicitly, I think, Soviet Union as both, an anti-colonial but also a colonial or imperial power. And this question reflected in my work. We have to understand how there was also competition for colonial discourse throughout the Cold War, but even before, which continues and has a legacy now. I looked, for example, how Hungarian anti-communist refugees, dissidents, try to construct this discourse of Soviet colonialism, and they try to ally with rising Afro-Asian powers, especially with India and some South Asians. And for example, the former Prime Minister Franz Nagy could actually influenced the conference at Bandung in 1955 to put forth this argument that there is a Soviet colonialism and Eastern Europe should be included in the issue of post-colonial countries. On the other hand, so there are other types of anti-colonialisms, not just the socialist or Soviet. On the other hand, socialist countries also try to exploit this kind of anti-colonial discourse against the West and make the same alliances with the same countries. But what's really striking is that they use the same arguments from Eastern European history of why we should historically be considered as colonial, right? And it was striking to see that very different political positions often use the same historical experiences in trying to persuade other regional, experiences and how to connect. So we have to keep that in mind because that also affects what we have today. We don't remember today that 1956 revolution in Hungary was not just about, the Soviets beat us, but it was also a moment where we almost became part of the non-aligned world, as there were motivations and ambitions to actually become part of that group. And what I told the story was really this wider story of refugees also affected this. So we have other ways to, intercept these kind of national canons of 1956, 1848, or these kind of historical moments which sink into our memories as colonial, only from the perspective of, for example, the Soviets or the Nazis or some specific powers, had atrocities against us.
Thank you, Zoltan.
Could I just come in with one more point?
Sure.
Just to pick on what Zoltan was saying, also to think about a kind of interconnected history of decolonizations, right? Because certainly the ways in which, the formation of nation states after World War I, 1989, and kind of collapse of communism and Soviet empire as it's framed, are often seen as, incidents relating to European history, but not something connected to broader decolonization movements. So how to do that? So just to suggest two things. One is the ways in which increasingly in the 1930s, what had been achieved in Eastern Europe was thought to be likely to be achieved elsewhere in the world. And indeed, the antecedent of the term decolonization, that is counter-colonization, was used to describe exactly that. Look, it's happened to Eastern Europe, it's going to happen elsewhere in the world. And there are lots of other ways, of course, of connecting this up. But then also to think about the ways in which global decolonization across Africa and Asia in accelerating through the 1950s had its impact in Eastern Europe. To think, as some people have done, actually about the end of Stalinism, de-Stalinization itself as a form of decolonization. But also to think about the ways in which it gave a language of empire and opposition to empire into opposition movements, and more generally into socialist culture, and the way in which that fed into languages of opposition. But what is interesting, I think, is that through the 50s, 60s, into the 70s, this is often very internationalist. But the kind of claims on defeating the Soviet empire as it comes out in the late 70s into the 80s has become very provincialized. So I also wonder whether there's a story of kind of global interconnection and coloniality that's part of the 60s discussion, but then feeds into these later movements. But, the return to Europe in many ways kind of provincializes them. It just becomes a regional or national struggle against Moscow. But I think there are lots of interesting ways to connect up these moments that it's not done enough in our history.
Yeah, thank you, James. Well, the questions also show that we need indeed more than an hour to talk about this, obviously, and there is an urgency and necessity of these debates, but we have also reached the end of our time. So I would like to thank our speakers for accepting our invitation to be here. Thanks to Zoltan for thinking together to make this event happen. So I would like to remind you again that we will continue our conversation on decolonizing Eastern Europe with the second event on April 7th. Please follow ACE's website and also the Twitter account for updates and registration. And we are receiving so many thank yous in the chat box. I'm really happy that we have organized this event. There are also a number of movies and also book suggestions shared through the chat box. So we will download also this to maybe create some kind of a document about how to improve our understandings of these debates. And also, please follow the Decolonizing Eastern Europe social media accounts administered by Zoltan on Facebook and Twitter. And it's through these social accounts that, I have also made the initiative to organize these events. So social media also has helped us to make this happen. Well, thank you for being with us, and I hope to see you in other events, and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.